Greetings all. I am going to go back a couple of Q&As now to a question which was posed about Christie tanks. I had said that I was going to reserve the question for a dedicated video. This is that video. The commonly held viewpoint as to why the US didn't go with Christie tanks was that the man was a little bit difficult to get along with, and that it was his personality, and not anything else, which scuppered the chances of the US Army having fleets of the American equivalent to the Soviet BT tank. This sort of misses the truth a little bit. Yes, he was certainly difficult to work with, and yes, his clashes with the US Army resulted in his losing at least one contract, actually more. But the record is such that it is probably not fair to say that the US Army didn't give the Christie design a fair shake. Consider, in the 15 years, 1920 to 1934, the US Army purchased exactly 23 new tanks. Christie's comprised over half, 13 of them. Even after the M1 Light was selected for full production and the Army opened up the money taps and M1s started coming off the line by the score, a quarter of the tanks built in 1935 and 1936 were still Christie's. The US Army was not flush with cash in the interwar period, and the fact that they spent as many dollars as they did on Christie designs over nearly 2 decades and testing them obviously showed that they were well aware of the potential of the tanks. So what happened? Well, we shall start at the start. Christie was busy building various vehicles at the end of World War I to include self-propelled guns and some rather interesting suspension designs. The first tank he made for the Army, the M1919, was not a Christie suspension design as we know it today. Indeed, the main wheels had no suspension at all, they were unsprung. The center wheels could be raised up or down, usually up in wheeled mode and down when on the tracks. He wasn't wasting any time on his convertible ideas, he was on it from the very start. Now, nothing really looked like an M1919 before or since. The gun was a 57mm or a 6-pounder in a massive turret for the 2-turret crew with a coaxial caliber 30 and another caliber 30 in the cupola. This was not in the later Christie tradition of being rockets on tracks. The thing did all of 7 miles an hour, 13 when on the wheels only. He took the vehicle back to the shop for conversion in 1920, and when it came back, it was in a configuration closer to what we would be familiar with towards the end of the decade. The turret had been removed, the middle wheels came in a bit bigger, and the main weapon would be found in the front hull. The front was vertical, albeit something of a blunt nose on a point. Maneuverability was poor, and the vehicle unreliable. Christie went back to his workshop, made a couple of amphibious vehicles which US Army did not buy, and would not really be seen again until 1928. In the meantime, the Army was still working on making its own tanks as well. It bought its first light tanks in 4 years, in 1927, the T1 Light and the T1 Medium. 4 more T1s followed the next year, and 2 more were ordered the year after that, and also the T2 Medium. However, in October of 1928, Christie came back with a stunner. The M1928 was a sleek vehicle with 3 machine guns, one of which was in the bow of the rather pointed nose. The thing proved to be a speed demon on its 4 large, independently sprung road wheels with a 338 horsepower Liberty engine and the chain drive to the last road wheel for road use. In November, it did a 140-mile run to Gettysburg and back from Fort Meade, Maryland. And I should say, the Fort Meade, South Dakota, where I went to OCS. On the way out, on the wheels, it did 70 miles an hour. On the way back, on tracks, it hit 42. Not bad for something which weighs nearly 9 tons in the 1920s. 2 sets of folks were impressed. The Soviets, who were in the US to buy the T1E1, suddenly lost all interest in the ordnance design and bought a couple of tanks off of Christie, as well as the patents. The other set of folks was the US Army, who realized that this thing actually had some promise and they needed to buy one for testing as well. This is where we had the first real difference of opinion between Christie and the US Army. Christie had his own ideas of what a tank needed to do, the Army had its ideas. Eventually, they finally came to some form of accord between the two, and an order was placed for model 1931. Needed a little bit of tweaking, and after the changes were made, it was considered acceptable for purchase. 7 more were bought. They were named the Convertible Medium Tank T3. Immediately, 4 kicked over the cavalry and redesignated as Combat Cars T1. The cavalry weren't allowed tanks, you see, back then. Only the infantry could have tanks. The main mechanical difference between the two really was in the armament. The T3 tank had a 37mm and a coaxial caliber 30, whilst the cavalry vehicle had a caliber 50 with a coaxial caliber 30. The armor was highly sloped at the front, 5/8 of an inch thick. Now at 11 tons, the vehicle was able to top out at about 47 miles an hour on wheels and 27 on tracks, well in excess of basically anything else to be found. These, thus, were the first US tanks to have the distinctive Christie-type suspension involving large springs which would be located inside the hull. However, there was a problem. Sloped or not, the armor on the vehicle was considered excessively thin, and the one-man turret was not considered to have the firepower suited to a medium tank. The Army wanted something a little bit more formidable. Christie wasn't so keen on producing what the Army wanted, and indeed if you look at his proposed designs in the 1930s, you'll see that he was rarely interested in things like turrets. As far as he was concerned, it seems that the springs would take up all the room inside the vehicle that they wanted. Space for a turret ring was hardly worth a worry. Eventually, the Army did settle on a design. However, because the Army had been sufficiently impressed back in 1920 of some of the ideas, and Christie had been fairly desperate for cash, Christie had sold the Army the rights to not only everything he had invented, but also things yet to be invented, which included his suspension. As a result, the Army simply bypassed the man and went to another manufacturer. The next 5 Christie tanks had very little to do with Christie at all. The man was now out of the loop, and the 5 T3E2s were manufactured by the American LaFrance and Fomite Corporation of Elmira, New York. Christie's irritability at this point is now removed from the equation. It is purely a matter of the tank's design. The T3E2 was something a bit more like what infantry branch was looking for. It was much wider, so it had room for a hull gunner as well as a 2-man turret. The US Army's enamorment of more DACA is also evidenced by the fact that the 2 crewmen in the turret had 4 machine guns and a cannon to play with. Other changes included the replacement of the inverted drive wheel, where the center guides were the propulsion teeth, to a more traditional sprocket wheel, and the track links were reduced to about half the pitch, which is the distance from hinge to hinge. It may have increased friction, but it also would have resulted in smoother movement around the running gear. They also upped the engine to a Continental of 435 horsepower. Now this thing really booked it at 35 miles an hour on tracks, although only 58 miles an hour on wheels. The vehicle wasn't perfect by any means. There were defects in the welding, the combination mount for the weapons was extremely difficult to build, but those were hardly Christie's fault. A bigger problem was that the transmission seemed unable to handle requirements, and an even bigger problem than that seemed to be that nobody really knew how to steer the thing. It's fine on wheels when you're just steering the front wheels a smidgen, but when you're cruising along at over 30 miles an hour and your form of steering on tracks is clutch brake, driving can be quite an exciting proposition, and holding on for dear life would have been pretty much par for the course for the other crewmen, at least if they knew a turn was coming. Final drives weren't really up to snuff either. Another interesting problem, which I have to say I hadn't really looked into before, is the issue of the differential. When you have clutch brake steering on the tracks, one doesn't really need to worry about a differential when you're going around the corners. It is, however, a problem when you're running on wheels steered by angling the front wheels. Now, it's to be noted that the Army weren't happy to just let Christie's design sit unchallenged. After witnessing the M1928, they wondered if there was a way of applying Christie's big wheel ideas in another way. And this was also rather forced upon them as part of the arguments that the Army were having with Christie at the time over the internal dimensions of the crew compartment. The Army simply told Ordnance to go ahead and design their own one, and they had Rock Island build it. The result was the Combat Car T2, which came with a driver, an assistant driver, neither of which had adequate legroom, and a chap in the turret, interestingly identified in the test report as a gunner, not as a commander. In the slightly more reasonable looking turret was a caliber 50, a caliber 30 and an external caliber 30 and an AA mount. The Continental 7-cylinder A70 radial is mounted in the rear despite the apparent hood, which is actually just, it covers the fuel tanks. The spring arrangement was though a little bit different to the Christie ideas. The front wheels are on coil springs like Christie, but the Army decided to go for a leaf spring bogie at the rear. Again, probably something to do with internal volume. Maximum speed was 38 miles an hour on wheels, 27 on tracks. Not bad. Interestingly, when belting along at over 30 miles an hour, it meant that the vehicle tended to be a little bit light on the front wheels, which made steering a little bit tricky. Unlike the Christie tanks, the chain for the road drive was mounted as needed externally. There were a slew of faults with the vehicle, few of which were particularly due to the suspension. For example, the driver couldn't see the dash, the two hull crewmen interfered with the turret rotation, and if the machine gun was fired facing forwards, it had a habit of depositing hot shell casings down their shirts. More importantly, the centre of balance was too far to the rear, the ride could be better, the engine was underpowered, and the ground clearance was too low. Additional leafs to the springs and the lift solved the last problem, but the rest required a complete rebuild. The next tank the Army bought was another Christie, except this time the combat car T4 was manufactured by Rock Island. Only one was made, again they're just experimenting. The Army were much happier with this one. The vehicle was wide enough to have the two hull crewmen side by side, complete with a hull gun. The suspension design was rejiggered a bit by a then Major Gladian Barnes, angling the springs so as to take up far less height. The tank could thus be over 2 feet shorter. It retained the more traditional sprocket wheel and had a 4-man crew. The R675 radial of 264 horsepower was connected in a single removable power pack to a 4-speed transmission and, importantly, a controlled differential steering system, which made the vehicle far easier to handle. Things were looking promising, even if the vehicle wasn't quite as light and as fast as the Army wanted. Cavalry wanted the vehicle to be lighter, but to go faster, and that required a bigger engine, which required a larger and heavier vehicle. Still, the tank was sent in for a rebuild with a new turret and front hull and a few other changes to include twin fixed forward firing machine guns. A crew of 5 were able to change the wheeled to tracked mode in under 7 minutes. Or in the case of one instance when they were driving through icy conditions, you really needed to put something on the wheels, they did it faster than the truck accompanying the vehicle could put on the chains. Now, I'd say 5-man crew. It was 5 men working on the tracks, not 5 men in the vehicle. Engine access was highly positively commented upon as well for ease of maintenance. The resulting vehicle arrived for tests in May of 1934 and was put through its paces. It ran mainly on wheels as cavalry figured that would be the most utilized configuration for speed. Hey, it's cavalry. By this point, a new contender had also arrived on the field, the combat car T5, a much smaller vehicle running on a vertical volute suspension system. As a result, all 4 vehicles available, the Christie T1, actually 2 of them, the LaSalle T3 medium and the Rock Island T4 and the Rock Island T5 were tested together with a few other vehicles. The highlight was a 550-mile speed run on wheels, except for the T5 of course, which was not a convertible tank, mainly on dirt roads on a 110-degree day in Fort Riley. One of the T1s burned out a connecting rod, the other, which was being used, got itself stuck in gumbo mud, whatever that is, and it ended up turning back after being extricated. The T3 overheated and fell out, and even an M1 armoured car failed due to another connecting rod failure. T4 did suffer a lock pin failure on the front wheel, which was spot welded within 10 minutes. Otherwise, it and the T5 both finished the course. Speeds of 50 to 55 miles an hour were obtained, presumably downhill, as the T4 was not capable of breaking 45 miles an hour on level ground. It should be noted that Honeycutt seems to imply that the vehicle was slower than it really was. 45 miles an hour was proven to be the top speed on wheels and 30 on tracks. The T4 did manage to cross a few obstacles which the T5 failed, a 40-degree downslope and a large hidden ditch, but by and large the T5 did manage to hold its own. This is where the first real problem starts to hit the Christie-type designs. Combat car T4E1 came in at almost exactly 10 tons, topped out at the aforementioned 45 miles an hour on wheels, 30 on tracks, had equivalent to about a half inch of armour, and was over 16 feet long. T5 came in at a little under 8.5 tons. The target weight was only 13.5 feet long, could hit 45 miles an hour on tracks, and was armoured to about 3/4 of an inch equivalent. It was also substantially cheaper. Cavalry were still impressed with the T4 and subject to a slew of further modifications, which varied from moving the bow gun forward 3 inches, fitting the gunner seat with a 3-inch mover to the rear, fitting it with the frontal armor plates of the T5, or adding armor to the engine cover, or improving the brakes, which they hoped all told wouldn't bring this thing to over 10.5 tons. Do all that and they wanted to buy 28 more of the vehicles. Now, still, imagine you are now the US Army in 1934. You have 2 vehicles which you feel can actually do the required job. One is lighter, faster, cheaper, and basically ready for production. The other needs a few tweaks in addition to the extra costs. About the only real benefit may be cross-country speed, which apparently isn't all that important to the cavalry anyway, as evidenced by the more testing being conducted in trackless mode. So is it really worth your time buying the second vehicle instead of just opening up full production on the first? And that's basically what happened. The combat car T5 entering production as the combat car M1, and later it was redesignated as light tank M1A2. It effectively became the winner. It was quite simply a better tank overall, considering all factors, than the Christie-type design. The last major hurrah was the medium tank T4. So again, using the Christie design, but built by Rock Island. 16 of them were made, and you might have to look twice to tell it from a combat car T4. Your best bet is to look at the shape of the whole machine gun bulge, see if there are mounts for the fixed wing machine guns, or easiest of all, check out the roofline of the turret. The vehicle had about half as much armour again as the combat car T4 from which it was derived, or in other words, about 5/8 of an inch at a pretty good slope. Again, we have a regular sprocket wheel and a turret with a caliber 50 and caliber 30 in it. It wasn't all that slow, 37 miles an hour on wheels, 24 miles an hour on tracks. But then again, it wasn't all that fast either. Note that the bigger, heavier T5, later M2 medium, with more armour was capable of breaking 30 miles an hour on the tracks. Now, in fairness, by the time the M2 was placed into service, gearings and weights had changed such that the maximum speed was governed to 26. But still, that was actually better than T4's tracked speed, and infantry branch didn't really seem too pushed about trackless capability. To quote a later test report, in the medium tank T4, we had a heavy and costly vehicle whose only attribute over the light tanks was its ability of accomplishing long, rapid strategic runs. Basically had the same armament, less armor. One T4 remains. It's technically a medium tank M1. Yes, it was officially standardized, very briefly, mainly due to war exigencies. It's currently under restoration by the lads of Fort Benning, so who knows, with any luck I may be able to get my camera into it yet. We'll see. There was one more try at making a big wheel convertible tank, the combat car T7. Think of it as a light tank M1 with a new suspension. It was not a Christie-type vehicle, despite the criteria. The rear 4 wheels were on leaf springs. The idea was to make an even more strategically mobile vehicle and see if tactical operation could be enhanced. The vehicle would hit 45 miles an hour on wheels, 35 on tracks. Didn't really work out well though. Wheel alignment could not be maintained. The front wheel just simply fell off several times as well, though the offending part was later identified and fixed. Given that they gave the vehicle pneumatic tires for better road running, they had to add over 1/3 ton of weight to create track guides to prevent the guide horns on the tracks from rubbing away at the tires. So this did not help matters. In the end, the thinking seemed to be that the vehicle held some promise to improve upon the M1, but it would take some work. Late 1939, though, the Army simply decided it was no longer worth the hassle and moved on to other things. And that was basically the end of the US Army's looking at Christie's suspension. There was a brief look at fitting it to a Sherman, but it really didn't seem to be worth the additional 1.5 tons over the bogies or the loss of internal volume. And a similar external coil spring arrangement briefly showed up on the T-49 or T-67 tank destroyers, but the Army basically just considered it a dead end. They did try torsion bars instead. It's to be noted that the complications of trackless running were discarded for these later evaluations, much as they were discarded on what would become T-34. So there you have it. I submit that the US Army gave the Christie suspension a fair shake and due consideration. And given that, well, A, Christie himself wasn't in the picture for the second half of the testing program, B, the Christie-produced convertible tanks weren't as good as the Rock Island-produced ones, and C, none of them seemed to be as good a fit for the Army as the Ordnance designs, the US did not exactly cut off its nose to spite its face. Personality clashes with Christie had very little to do with anything, and the reason that the US failed to use the fantastic and revolutionary suspension system like the Russians and later British did was actually for perfectly rational and sensible reasons. Anyway, I hope you found the above interesting and informative, and I will see you on the next one.